At 2:45 in the morning on the 21st of July, 1983, at a Soviet research station on the East Antarctic Plateau, a thermometer read -89.2 degrees Celsius. It is the coldest temperature ever directly measured on the surface of this planet. 43 years later, nothing has beaten it. The station is called Vostok. It sits 3.5 kilometers above sea level, 1,300 kilometers from the South Pole. And for 4 months of every year, the sun does not rise there at all. 13 people spend the winter. And 4 kilometers directly beneath that thermometer, beneath the coldest air ever recorded, there is a lake. Liquid water. It has never frozen. 3 things happened at Vostok, and they do not resolve in the order you expect. The first is that number, -89.2. Hold on to it, because the story ends by turning it inside out. The second is something that came up out of that lake in 2012. A living thing that matches nothing on the books. Not a new species. Not even a new family. Something that could not be filed under any known branch of life at all. And the third is a mistake. A single, foreseeable, entirely human mistake that may have cost us the answer to a 15-million-year-old question. We will get to all 3, but start with the lake, because almost nobody knows it is there. Lake Vostok is roughly 250 kilometers long and 50 kilometers wide. It is comparable in area to Lake Ontario. People describe it as the size of New Jersey. In places, it is more than 800 meters deep. It is fresh water, and it is the largest of nearly 400 subglacial lakes now known to exist under the Antarctic ice sheet. The only one big enough to have its own internal currents. Its own tides. There are tides moving in the dark under 4 kilometers of ice right now, and no human being has ever seen them. It stays liquid for 2 reasons. Pressure, from the unimaginable weight of ice pressing down on it, and heat, leaking upward from the rock beneath. Those 2 things together hold the water below its normal freezing point without letting it freeze. The ceiling of that lake is not stone. It is the underside of a glacier, and it is slowly melting into the water it sits on. Now, the number that matters. That lake has been sealed beneath continuous ice for at least 15 million years. Some estimates run considerably higher. 15 million years ago, there were no humans. There was no genus Homo. The Mediterranean had not yet dried out and refilled. Whatever is in that water has been running its own experiment in total darkness, with no light, no fresh nutrients from above, and no contact with the surface biosphere for a span of time that makes all of recorded history look like a rounding error. So, of course, someone was going to drill into it. 15 million years, and it is right there, 4 kilometers below a research station that already exists. If you have ever stood in front of a door you were told not to open, you know the specific quality of that silence. The Russian Antarctic expedition began the effort in 1989. The borehole is called 5G. Keep that word in mind. Sealed. It is about to become the most important word in this story, and not in the way you think. Before you hear what came out of that lake, tell me in the comments. If you had one shot at a place nothing has touched in 15 million years, what would you be most afraid of finding? Answer honestly. Then, keep watching. Here is the problem nobody outside the project appreciates, and it is the whole story. You cannot drill a 4-kilometer hole through ice and leave it empty. Ice at that depth is under enormous pressure. An empty hole closes. It flows shut, slowly and relentlessly, exactly the way the granite closed on the Soviets at Kola. To keep an ice borehole open, you have to fill it with fluid, with something that will not freeze at minus 50 degrees and will hold the walls apart against the weight of a glacier. The Russians used a mixture of kerosene and freon, tons of it, a 4-kilometer column of aviation fuel and refrigerant standing inside the ice, directly above the most pristine body of water on Earth. Read that again. The only way to reach a lake that has been isolated for 15 million years was to point 60 tons of kerosene directly at it. The tool and the crime are the same object. Everyone knew. It was debated publicly for years. An international panel at the American Geophysical Union was arguing about how to sample Vostok as early as 2002. The question was not academic and it was not polite. If that fluid drains into the lake, you do not get a second chance. You do not get to try again in 50 years. There is one lake. It has been sealed since before our species existed, and you get exactly one attempt to open it without ruining it. So the Russians came up with something genuinely clever. They would not drill into the lake at all. They would let the lake drill into them. The water down there is under enormous hydrostatic pressure, 4 kilometers of ice pressing on it. So the plan was this: drill to within a few meters of the ceiling, then stop. Withdraw. Let the last thin membrane of ice fail on its own. And when it fails, the pressure in the lake will do the rest. The water will not sit still and let the kerosene fall into it. The water will come up. On Saturday, the 4th of February, 2012, the drill hit water at about 3,766 meters. For a few hours, it looked like the moment had arrived. It had not. The team examined it and concluded it was a water lens, a pocket sitting above the lake, not the lake itself. They kept going. On the 5th of February 2012, at 3,769 meters, a little over 2 1/3 miles down, the drill broke through. And the lake came up the hole. Water surged upward into the borehole, driven by 15 million years of accumulated pressure, and rose roughly 30 to 40 meters before it hit ice cold enough to stop it. There it froze. Solid. A plug of frozen lake water sealing the borehole from below in a hole that had been drilled for 23 years. It worked exactly as designed. When the crew hauled the drill back to the surface, the entire assembly came up encased in ice. Ice made of water that no human being and no living thing on the surface of this planet had touched in 15 million years. Valery Lukin, who led the expedition, compared it to putting a man on the moon. Standing at the coldest place on Earth, in a season when the sun does not rise, they had opened a door that had been closed since before there were people to close it. And then they analyzed the water. Take the number this video opened with, minus 89.2, and set it next to what happens now. The coldest, harshest, most inhospitable point on the planet was not the hard part. Getting there was not the hard part. The hard part was arriving without leaving fingerprints. If you have ever done everything right and lost anyway on a detail you saw coming, this next part is going to sit badly with you. Stay with me. It gets stranger before it gets clearer. In October of 2012, the Russian team reported their findings. They had found no native life. None. The only microbes in the samples were traced back to contaminants from the drilling oil. The kerosene had got in. Not enough to poison the lake, as far as anyone can tell. The self-sealing plug appears to have held. But enough. More than enough. To get into the water, they pulled back out. And once your sample is dirty, every single thing you find in it is suspect. You cannot tell the difference between a microbe that has been living in that lake for 15 million years and a microbe that hitched a ride down the hole on the fluid you brought with you. Then, On the 6th of March, 2013, the story changed again. Sergei Bulat, a researcher at the St. Petersburg Institute of Nuclear Physics, announced that in the frozen lake water they had found a bacterium that belonged to none of the known bacterial phyla. Not a new species, not a new genus, or family or order. A phylum is one of the great trunks of the tree of life, the level at which vertebrates are separated from mollusks. He was saying this thing did not fit on any branch. It has a designation, W123-10. It shows less than 86% genetic similarity to any organism on record. Every attempt to assign it to a known bacterial division failed. The only thing it clusters with is another unidentified sequence. One found years earlier in Vostok ice, also unassignable, also nameless. Bulat says it passed every contamination control they could devise. He published it in the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society. And plenty of his colleagues said immediately and publicly that the announcement was premature because the sample had kerosene in it. Here is the part I want to be careful about because it cuts both ways, and the honest version is less satisfying than the version you want. Roughly 90% of the bacteria on Earth have never been cultured in a laboratory. Their genomes are unknown, which means a genetic sequence that matches nothing in our databases is not automatically alien or ancient or extraordinary. It might simply be a bacterium nobody has written down yet. There are a great many of those. So W123-10 is either a life form that has been evolving in the dark, alone, since before our ancestors came down from the trees, or it is a very ordinary microbe that we ourselves carried down a hole and then failed to recognize. Nobody can currently tell you which. That is not a cliffhanger I am constructing. That is the actual state of the science. And then it gets stranger from an entirely different direction. A molecular biologist named Scott Rogers at Bowling Green State University in Ohio took a different approach. He did not study the lake water. He studied accretion ice. Lake water that has frozen onto the underside of the glacier over long periods, a record of the lake pressed into the ceiling above it. His team spent a decade developing a decontamination protocol precisely because Vostok results had been plagued by contamination for years. A bleach wash, staged melting, discarding the outer layers of every core. In July of 2013, he published the results. More than 3,500 unique genetic sequences. Most were bacteria and fungi. That was expected. But among them were sequences from organisms that live around hydrothermal vents. Bacteria that live in the guts of rainbow trout, of lobsters, of tube worms, genetic material from tiny deep-sea mollusks, and from the water flea, a small crustacean. Read that list again and notice what is wrong with it. Those are not the residents of a sealed freshwater lake in the dark. Those are the residents of an ocean. Which raises a possibility that is either magnificent or embarrassing, and there is no third option. Either Lake Vostok has a marine past, and fragments of that ecosystem persisted through the ice, or the samples are dirty in ways we still do not fully understand. And even Rogers is careful. The concentration of life in that ice is between 1 and 100 cells per milliliter. A normal lake carries thousands of times more. His own summary was blunt. If there is life in Vostok, it is interesting life. It is not abundant life. That is the entire finding. A handful of cells in a sample we cannot fully trust from a lake we get one shot at. And here is the detail that makes all of it harder to sit with. While the Russians were still arguing about whether their sample was clean, another team had already taken one. In January of 2013, 11 months after Vostok, an American project called Wizard drilled into a different Antarctic lake, subglacial Lake Whillans in West Antarctica. They did not use kerosene. They used hot water. The drill was built at the University of Nebraska. It melts its way down. The meltwater is filtered, first at 2 microns, then at 0.2 of a micron. Then blasted with ultraviolet light to kill anything that survived the filters. Then heated to 90 degrees and pumped down a kilometre of hose. Nothing is left standing in the hole. There is nothing to spill. The borehole is made out of the lake's own sealing, melted, sterilized, and sent back down. On the 28th of January 2013, they broke through 800 meters of ice. Within hours, they had bacteria. Not an ambiguous sequence. Not a phylotype that might or might not be contamination. Living cells. More than 450,000 of them in every teaspoon of water. They published the first detailed description of microbial life in an Antarctic subglacial lake in the journal Nature. Nobody disputed it. Nobody had to. To this day, only 2 subglacial lakes in Antarctica have ever been sampled cleanly. Whillans in 2013 and Lake Mercer 6 years later. Lake Vostok, the deepest, the oldest, the largest, the one everybody actually wants to know about, is not on that list. But before you decide the Russians simply did it wrong, look at the numbers. Lake Whillans sits under 800 meters of ice. Lake Vostok sits under 4,000. The hot water drill that gave the Americans their clean answer was designed for 1,000 meters and could be stretched with enough hose to 2,000. It cannot reach Vostok. It is not remotely close. And Lake Whillans is less than 2 meters deep. It is a puddle under a glacier, roughly the area of Crater Lake and about as deep as a backyard swimming pool. Vostok is 800 meters deep and has tides. So this is not a story about careless Russians and careful Americans. It is worse than that. It is a story in which the only method that produces an answer you can trust cannot reach the lake that is actually worth asking. The Russians did not choose kerosene because they were sloppy. They chose it because at 4 kilometers down, there is nothing else that works. In January of 2015, they went back and did it as properly as they could. The St. Petersburg Institute of Nuclear Physics built a dedicated clean sampler, a titanium tube 2 meters long, weighing about 50 kilograms with its own heating and pumping system, holding exactly 1 liter of water. It was leak tested to guarantee that not a single drop of the kerosene and freon mixture could reach the inside. The Russians drilled again, and they took 1 clean liter from a lake sealed for 15 million years. 1 liter, 26 years after they started drilling. So, what is in Lake Vostok? The honest answer in 2026 is that we still do not know. And the reason we do not know is not that the lake is too deep or the ice too thick or the cold too severe. We solved all of that. 23 years of drilling at the coldest place on the planet, an ingenious self-sealing pressure design that worked on the first attempt, a drill that came back to the surface wearing a jacket of 15-million-year-old ice. We did every hard thing correctly. And then we got fuel on the answer. This is not a footnote. This is the point. Because Lake Vostok is not really about Antarctica. Europa, the moon of Jupiter, has a liquid water ocean beneath an ice shell kilometers thick. Enceladus, orbiting Saturn, has the same. They are the 2 most promising places in the solar system to look for life that is not us. And the barrier in both cases is a lid of ice with water underneath. Lake Vostok is the rehearsal. It is the one place on our own planet where we can practice the exact problem we will face out there. And we practiced, and it went well. And the sample still came back contaminated. Now, imagine doing it 600 million kilometers from here with a probe that cannot be recalled on a mission that will not be repeated in your lifetime, where the only thing standing between a genuine discovery and a permanent ambiguity is whether you brought your own microbes with you. Vostok is a warning. And it is the most useful thing that came out of that hole. So here is where it ends. On the East Antarctic Plateau, there is a station where the sun does not rise for 4 months, where 13 people spend the winter, where the air once fell to minus 89.2 degrees and has not been that cold anywhere on Earth since. And directly below it, below the coldest air ever measured, below 4 kilometers of ice, there is a lake with tides in it. Dark, liquid, 15 million years old. There is a hole in the ceiling of that lake. It is plugged with a column of the lake's own frozen water, which rose up to seal it the moment it was breached. The lake closing its own door behind us, the way it has stayed closed since before we existed. Down there, right now, in water no one has ever seen, there may be something that does not fit on the tree of life. Or there may be nothing at all, and we have been reading our own reflection in a puddle of kerosene. We opened it. We are still not sure what we saw. If you have made it this far, you already know this channel is not going to pretend to an answer it does not have. That is the whole job. Subscribe, and I will keep bringing you the ones where the door opens and the room is still dark. And tell me in the comments, the honest version, not the brave one. Was it worth opening?